But how has clock time entered in our lifestyles? How has it progressively imposed its rhythm on our lives? Professor Robert Levine has been investigating these questions.
The wristwatch, it's been said, became the handcuff of our time. Now, even if you don't wear the time on your wrist, you have the time on your cell phone, or you have the time on the clock on a wall, or you have little beep beeps that are emanating from all sorts of devices. And people have become really obsessed by keeping time, by keeping track of time. It's worth noting that it's only very recently that the idea of being punctual was a morally proper thing to do. And it's not something that necessarily emerged naturally. We developed these timepieces that allowed people to coordinate time and allowed us to measure whether somebody was early or late. But that was no justification about then using those mechanisms just because they were available. The word punctuality, when it first appeared in the English language, referred to a stickler for details. And it's only taken on its current meaning over the last several hundred years. If we walk through Europe, we see these great public clocks. So people could measure the time, so people could tie into the time. But they're also centerpieces. That's how important they were to people. Then we have smaller clocks that are developed, so the equivalent of the middle class can bring the time into their homes. And then it's only in France, I believe, where the first wristwatches were created. And if we look at what people thought of those watches at the time, they look like very quirky invention. And one can imagine, passing your friend and you see that they're wearing the time on their body, and that must have seemed like a very funny notion at first. Notably, this development of these precise timepieces were coming about just after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the availability of time to a wide range of people was coming along at, excuse the pun, but just the right time for these businesses. And what we find is that there are people who are promoting, they were marketing the value of living by clock time, of being punctual and making every moment count.
Point out your unprofitable employees. Most employees mean to be on time. If they come late one morning, they intend being on time the next. But experience shows that it is the same old story over and over again with the tardy ones. And the only way to make employees appreciate the value of lost time is to let them pay for it themselves. With an international time recording system, you can stop losses through late coming and early leaving.
These sort of messages were very heavy-handedly being marketed to the companies because, this was a competitive world. Time is money, and if you lost track of that time, then you were going to fail. But we also see some under-the-table sorts of marketing. Here we are at a grammar school here in San Francisco, California, where we have young children who are learning some of the basic values that likely will follow them through their lives. If these students had been attending a school like this back just about 120 years ago, they would have been reading books which were promoting the morality, the absolute morality, not just the efficiency of learning how to tell time and living life by clock time, but sometimes the life and death consequences of living by clock time. If you look at children's readers, if you look back like in the 1880s at the McGuffey readers, which were very widely assigned in the United States, you see this idea of time being something that people had to learn, being promoted in ways that were sometimes quite disturbing. I'll read you one little excerpt. This was for fifth graders. A railroad train was rushing along at almost lightning speed. The conductor was late, but he hoped to pass the curve safely. In an instant, there was a collision, a shriek, a shock, and 50 souls were in eternity, and all because an engineer was behind time. Napoleon died a prisoner at St. Helena because one of his marshals was behind time. The messages were then taken further. There were messages about how it could lead to the downfall of economies, it could lead to war, and then once you get in the war, it would lead to failure at war, and it could certainly lead to the destruction of your romantic relationships. And so you have kids, you have these fifth graders hearing this, and at the same time, the time-selling companies are marketing the need to be able to have these mechanisms to be on time to adults. And it was very quickly, very soon, this combination of the availability and the seduction of these timepieces and this sort of promotion that turned around thinking about clock time, that had people beginning to accept the fact that basically down that clock time is the way to go. There was always a rebellion against it. There were always people talking about their own variation on slow time, but it was lagging behind. It always stayed in somewhat the exotic range, and there was the assumption that if you really wanted to make it, if you really wanted to move forward in this modern world, then you had to buy into clock time.